Hello everyone. In this video, we'll continue talking about sacred space, which we defined as any hotspot of God's presence. We learned from the Hebrew Bible that prior to Christ, access to the presence of God was restricted almost exclusively to the Jewish people. And even within Israel, only certain members of the community, priests and Levites, were permitted to access God's presence more directly in the tabernacle and temple. Yet the work of Christ made the presence of God available to all of humanity, i.e., he prepared a place in the household of the Father. In the fourth gospel, although not explicitly stated, Jesus' work as Passover lamb, which we'll talk about in a later session, is the activity that renders the sacred space of God's household available to the world. More specifically, Jesus makes the presence of God available to those who were formerly excluded from it. But before we get to that, we need to discuss a bit more about sacred space. The holiness of the Jewish land and people was highly stratified. Restrictions upon sacred space served both to preserve the presence of God among his people, as well as protect humans from the dangerous presence of God. Entering any sacred space, especially the temple or tabernacle, without proper procedures could result in dire consequences, as when Nadab and Abihu were incinerated for offering, quote, strange fire upon the altar in Leviticus 10. The temple and tabernacle weren't the only holy spaces in Israel, though. From the Mishnah, we learn that 10 degrees of holiness exist in geographical space. In increasing levels of holiness, we first have the land of Israel, then walled cities within the land, then the city of Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, the outer court of the temple, the court of women, the court of the Israelites, then the court of the priests, the area between the porch and the altar, the inner sanctuary, and finally, the Holy of Holies. Now, each holy space carried restrictions as to who was allowed to enter. For example, lepers weren't allowed in walled cities, and no man with a flux or menstruating woman could approach the Temple Mount. Sources disagree whether Gentiles were allowed to enter the outer court of the temple, but non-Jewish people certainly were not allowed to go beyond it. Women weren't permitted beyond the court of the women, and only ritually pure Jewish men were allowed into the court of the Israelites. Only priests were allowed into the court of the priests, and only the high priest on the Day of Atonement could enter the Holy of Holies. An inscription unearthed from the area around the court of the Israelites proves enlightening. The message prohibits access to Gentiles and warns those who would trespass. The prohibition reads, quote, "No foreigner is to enter within the forecourt and the balustrade around the sanctuary. Whoever is caught will have himself to blame for his subsequent death." In sum, access to the presence of God was highly restricted, and violating the prescribed spaces could result in severe consequences, whether from God or from the Jewish leaders. The restrictions on sacred space also reflected socio-cultural concerns. The concept of limited good was a staple of first century Mediterranean thought. If one family or individual gained resources, fewer resources are then available for others. Non-tangible concepts, by extension, were also perceived to be finite. For example, quote, "A prophet has no honor in his own country," John 4:44, because the only way to increase one's status was to take status away from others in that community. Jerome Nere explains, quote, "Jesus' increase in respect throughout Galilee lifts him high above his village peers, a situation which his neighbors perceive as an intolerable and unbalancing force that means their corresponding loss of honor in proportion to Jesus' gain." So in order to be considered an honorable person, one was expected to maintain the status quo and remain within the social standing ascribed at birth. Along similar lines, to encroach upon a sacred space disproportional to one's status and heritage was to act dishonorably, even sinfully. Such behavior threatened the well-being of the entire society by disrupting boundary lines that maintained cosmic order and ensured the well-being of the group. So stepping into a prohibited sacred space would classify as a dangerous action, not just for the offender, but for the entire community. But Jesus can remove the boundaries around sacred space because he himself is the embodiment of the temple and the associated rituals. By becoming the atoning sacrifice, the Passover lamb that is offered upon the altar of God, his own body, he fulfills every ritual necessary to approach the Father. Now, in our next video, I'll take you to the Gospel of John, and we'll look at specific passages where we see Jesus removing the boundary lines that separate people from God's presence and opening the door into the Father's household for everyone.